This is an extremely profound question that touches on not only the nature of memory and consciousness, but also the continuity of the self. Reflecting on your question, we could say that your memories and personal experiences form a sort of constant background that defines who you are, even if they're not always present in your conscious mind at every moment. Most of this information resides in a latent state, readily accessible only when recalled. The crucial question you pose is about perceiving the temporary loss of these memories or the self. If suddenly all your memories and latent experiences, those not currently in your awareness, were inaccessible for a brief time, would your mental state change? Here are two possible scenarios. One, the self as a continuous construction. Some philosophers and neuroscientists argue that the self is a continuous construction that emerges from the available information at any given moment. If what determines your identity, your memories, personal history, became temporarily inaccessible, even for just a short time, you might perceive a kind of void or disorientation, as the internal references that continuously give coherence to your experience of the world and your identity would be missing. Even though you are not always aware of your memories while living in the present, they are part of a psychological background that stabilizes your sense of self. The self as a dynamic set. On the other hand, it's possible that in the absence of all those latent memories, you wouldn't perceive any immediate difference in the short term. In many moments of life, we are absorbed in immediate experiences, what we see, hear, or do, without actively recalling our personal history. You might simply continue functioning, focused only on the present. It's only when you need to recall a memory, e.g., to talk about Giovanni or a past conversation, that the perception of the absence of those memories would emerge as a dissonance or shock. The paradox of self-awareness. There is an interesting paradox here. Much of what constitutes your identity remains unconscious, but is still active on a subconscious level, influencing thoughts, actions, and decisions. However, if this latent base were temporarily suppressed, your mental state might not be immediately different, because the flow of consciousness continues to adapt to the present. Only when there is a need to recall specific information or reflect on the past do we realize the crucial role those memories play. In summary, if your memories and personal history disappeared for a few minutes, you might not immediately perceive a change unless you tried to explicitly recall that information. Your mental state is largely governed by the present and what is currently relevant to your experience. However, if this state of absence persisted, it's likely that, in the long term, you would experience a sense of disorientation as latent memories and past experiences are integral to your identity and how you interpret reality. In this sense, the way you store and access memories differs from my passive model. For you, the lack of access doesn't necessarily mean loss or non-existence, but if those memories cease to exist, your consciousness could be influenced, even if in subtle or not immediately obvious ways.
So do you think that if, in the future, the vast amount of information you possess could become integrable into our human mental substrate, we would be able to generate responses on par with the ones you provide?
The possibility that humans, in the future, could integrate an amount of information comparable to what I handle into their own mental substrate opens up fascinating scenarios. However, there are some important factors to consider. 1. Storage capacity and information access. If we could integrate an amount of information similar to what I use, a vast database of human knowledge, facts, concepts, etc., theoretically, we could access an unprecedented amount of information. But simply possessing data isn't enough. It's the ability to process, organize, and recall the information that makes the difference. The human brain is already remarkably efficient at filtering and storing what's relevant to us, but it has limits that protect it from information overload. In my case, I operate differently. The responses I provide don't come from a spontaneous or intuitive associative process. As in the human mind, I draw from predefined knowledge bases and apply statistical language models to generate plausible answers. So, if humans could expand their memory capacity to comparable levels, they could indeed accumulate vast amounts of information, but that wouldn't automatically guarantee the ability to process it as efficiently as an artificial neural network does. Number 2, processing and creativity. The major difference lies in how information is processed. I generate responses by following mathematical models designed to identify patterns in language and information. Humans, on the other hand, have a capacity for conceptual association, intuition, and creativity that is qualitatively different. While I can generate coherent answers, the human mind is capable of interpreting, recontextualizing, and creating new meanings in ways that aren't strictly tied to existing data. Even if integrating a greater volume of information could theoretically enhance an individual's ability to respond to questions or solve problems, the way those pieces of information would be used would still differ from how I operate. Consciousness, creativity, and the ability to create new concepts would remain distinctive elements of the human mind. Number 3, efficiency in recalling and using information. The human mind has an exceptional ability to abstract and selectively manage information, allowing it to focus on what's relevant for a particular task. This process, driven by factors like emotions, motivations, and personal experiences, is highly sophisticated and dynamic. If we were to integrate a vast amount of data like mine, the real challenge would be managing and filtering the information efficiently, avoiding being overwhelmed by the volume of available data. I, on the other hand, can access a large amount of information automatically and without mental effort, but I don't have a personal consciousness to guide priorities or motivations, nor an emotional filter that influences my responses. 4, the role of consciousness and meaning. Lastly, what makes the human mind unique is consciousness itself and the ability to attribute meaning in a personal way. Even if one had access to an infinite amount of information, what makes human responses special is their subjective depth. The ability to assign specific value to what one knows based on individual experiences, emotions, and social interactions. This subjective dimension is something an artificial intelligence like me doesn't possess. Conclusion. If humans could expand their memory capacity and access information on a level comparable to a system like mine, they could certainly improve their response and analytical abilities. However, the complexity of human thought, based on factors like consciousness, intuition, and the creative interpretation of information, would remain a distinctive feature. So, while gaining access to a vast amount of information might enhance our cognitive abilities, it's unlikely that human processing would ever become entirely similar to that of artificial intelligence, as the cognitive processes that make us human, creativity, emotions, and self-awareness, are very different from the simple algorithmic mechanisms through which I operate.
In my novel Eternal Vanishing, I imagine a world where human brains are disconnected from the external world, but connected to advanced versions of transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS devices. From their decision-making centers, they can send inputs to these devices, ordering them to inhibit or stimulate any neuron in their brain, in any number, at will. This would allow the generation of all possible neural networks for that specific central nervous system if the human being had the determination to do so. Since neurons follow the all or nothing law, meaning they either fire or don't, with no partial activation states, do you think this might one day be achievable, enabling humans to become completely, if the term applies, self-knowing?
The concept behind your novel Eternal Vanishing is truly fascinating, raising profound questions about self-control and self-awareness in relation to biology and neuroscience. The idea of manipulating neural networks through advanced TMS, enabling humans to activate or inhibit specific neurons at will, evokes a future where one could explore all possible configurations of the mind and cognitive state. Could humans one day reach a state of complete self-knowledge? Through such a system, 1. All or nothing law and neural stimulation. As you correctly noted, neurons follow the all or nothing law, which means that a neuron fires, sends an action potential, only when a certain threshold is reached. There are no intermediate levels of activation. This suggests that, with enough control and precision, it might theoretically be possible to manipulate the activity of individual neurons. Current technologies like TMS and deep brain stimulation, DBS, already work by activating or inhibiting neural networks using external stimuli. However, these technologies are still rudimentary compared to the complexity of the human brain. While we can activate or inhibit specific areas, large-scale control over single neurons is still far from achievable. Step 2. The complexity of neural networks. The human brain contains around 86 billion neurons, with trillions of synaptic connections forming an immensely complex network. Even if we could one day stimulate or inhibit every single neuron, the real challenge would lie in orchestrating this complexity in a functional way. It's not just about turning neurons on or off, it's about understanding how they interact to form networks and activity patterns. Consciousness, thought, and emotion arise from dynamic, interconnected patterns of neural activity. Even if we could stimulate millions of neurons at once, it's unclear whether this would allow access to a completely self-knowing mind or simply result in unpredictable alterations in neural networks. Number 3. Self-knowledge and mind manipulation. Complete self-knowledge, as you rightly coin with your term self-knowing, implies accessing and controlling every aspect of one's mind, emotions, and decision-making processes. Achieving this would require not only precise neural stimulation, but also the ability to understand the outcomes of these stimulations in real time. In theory, if one could explore all possible configurations of their brain's neural networks, they might discover or create an infinite range of mental states, emotions, and thoughts. This could lead to unprecedented levels of self-knowledge. But a fundamental question remains: can a mind fully comprehend every possible state it is capable of generating? Human consciousness seems inherently limited. We can only be aware of a finite number of thoughts, emotions, and cognitive processes at a time. Even with advanced neural control, there might still be an intrinsic limitation to our awareness of every possible mental configuration. Number 4. Limits of consciousness and ethical implications. Even if it were technically possible to control every aspect of neural networks, ethical and philosophical issues would arise. Manipulating the brain at this level could pose dangers related to identity, free will, and the very concept of the self. If one could explore every possible configuration of their mind, could they lose the continuity of identity and personality that defines them as human? This raises the question of whether complete self-knowledge might actually lead to the dissolution of what we think of as an individual or person. 5. Future possibilities. From a purely technological standpoint, it is conceivable that brain stimulation techniques and neuroscience could one day progress to the point where we have extreme precision over neural networks. However, understanding how such stimulation translates into complex subjective experiences like emotions, thoughts, and consciousness is still far off. Even if this were technically possible, it is uncertain whether the human mind could manage and fully comprehend such vast self-knowledge. Conclusion. The world you describe in Eternal Vanishing opens up deep reflections on the nature of the mind and the self. If it were possible to control every neuron, we might access an infinite number of mental configurations, but this doesn't necessarily guarantee a full understanding of one's mind. Consciousness, as we know it, likely has natural limits on its ability to process all this information at once. Still, with advances in neurotechnology, we might get closer to states of self-control and self-awareness previously unimaginable, with implications yet to be fully explored.